Grasslands are one of the most widely utilized biomes on the planet, second to forests in both human use and human disruption. These ecosystems make up a very significant portion of the Earth's surface, 52.5 million square kilometers, or 40.5% of the Earth's terrestrial area, excluding Greenland and Antarctica. Millions of livestock farmers and ranchers depend on grasslands for their livelihoods. The grasslands provide a number of other ecological services, including soil formation, erosion control, nutrient recycling, storage of atmospheric carbon, gene pools for crossbreeding grain crops, maintaining biodiversity, and providing habitats and food for a variety of organisms. Most notably, grasslands offer a feed source for livestock, habitat for wildlife, and environmental protection and conservation of plant genetic resources. An area of land designated as grassland includes terrestrial landscaping covered by vegetation dominated by grasses. There are little or no trees occupying a grassland region. Grasslands occur naturally on all continents except Antarctica, and they can be managed either by public or private land managers with differing agendas on management objectives, including production and conservation goals. For an area to be considered a grassland, sufficient moisture must occur for grass growth, but not enough to elicit tree growth. The rainfall intensity must be between a desert and a forest biome, allowing for grazing and fires to occur. There are three main types of grasslands found all over the world: the edaphic, the climate, and the derived grassland. In an edaphic grassland, the soil is extremely poor in nutrients and is found primarily on hills or ridges with shallow soil, or in valleys with clay soil. These conditions prevent tree growth entirely, and the use of fires is not needed to preserve the grassland. Climate grasslands are found in special climate conditions, particularly tropical climates. A range of 20 to 50 inches of rainfall per year and periods of drought are essential for climate grasslands to occur. Droughts are especially important for fires to occur, otherwise the area would become a tropical forest. In a derived grassland, the cultivation of trees to plant crops is done by farmers, or trees are clear-cut by forestry companies. Once the trees are cleared, crops are planted until no fertile soil remains. Once depletion of soil occurs, the land is allowed 1 year to rejuvenate grasses naturally. Then grasses are burned and crops are planted in the ashes. These grass ashes have adequate nutrients for future crops. Most grassland is developed for arable farming, with the North American prairie being a prime example of such development. No grassland is entirely natural, and there are varying degrees of interference, including fire, man-made or natural, grazing by livestock or large herds of herbivores, and the clearing of woody vegetation, either by humans or other large animals. Before European settlement, nearly all of the central United States was grassland, but over the past 200 years, an increase in modern farming technologies and an increase in food demand have converted much of these naturally occurring grasslands to cropland. In fact, less than 20% of the native grasslands of North America prior to European settlement still exist today. Out of the 140 million acres in the tallgrass prairie, only 4% remains undisturbed. Rangeland is another term for relatively natural grasslands. These areas are unfenced grasslands located in temperate or tropical climates. They supply vegetation for grazing of grass-eating animals, or browsing for shrub-eating animals. Common practices found on rangelands that are pivotal for rangeland survival include grazing management, targeted grazing, prescribed burning, and reseeding with little or no chemicals applied. It's important on rangelands to try and keep the native grasses hardy and persistent. Otherwise, degradation of land use results, along with a slew of environmental hazards discussed later in this presentation. A pasture is another term for managed grasslands, or enclosed meadows with domesticated grasses. Grass is a renewable resource that can be grazed continually, so as long as only the upper half of the grass is eaten. If the entire grass is ripped from the ground, the grass takes a significantly longer period to rejuvenate, since the grass shoot grows from the base up. Extracting the entire grass shoot removes the relatively immediate basis for reproduction. In humid climates around the world, pastures provide 90% of the milk, 70% of the sheep and goat meat, and 35% of the beef meat in a community's diet. Therefore, the production of the pasture is important as the production of crops in order to increase a farmer's economic output. Grazing is one of the most critical components in managing grasslands. There are two main categories of grazing: commercial and traditional. In commercial grazing, the process is rather large scale, and typically only one or two animal species are used to graze the land, oftentimes cattle and sheep. This style of grazing was heavily utilized in the 19th century by farmers and ranchers in the Americas and Australia. Another style of grazing is traditional grazing, most commonly practiced by subsistence or self-sustaining farmers. A variety of livestock are allowed to graze on the land, while the livestock themselves provide multiple purposes, such as hides being used for clothing or bones for religious ceremonies. Traditional grazing is largely determined by the climate and farming system of the area. For the most profitable yield of any grassland, it is crucial for there to remain a balance between overgrazing and undergrazing. Overgrazing occurs when too many animals graze for a lengthy period of time and exceed the carrying capacity of a grassland area. It reduces the grass cover, exposes the soil to erosion, and enhances the invasion of exposed land by species like sagebrush and cactus. Overgrazing can also destroy a creek or river's riparian zone vegetation if livestock are prone to feasting along the banks of such water supply. One way to remedy the destruction of riparian zones is to create water holes or tanks in strategic places around the property to discourage the continued use of one natural water spring. Undergrazing, on the other hand, can occur where the absence of grazing for long periods of time, at least 5 years, can reduce the net primary productivity of the grassland vegetation and grass cover. Without sufficient grazing, grasslands can become of less value to cultivate than the amount of time and money it would take to redeem these lands. One way to sustain grassland productivity is to control the number and distribution of livestock. Rotational grazing can be an effective practice in which cattle are confined by portable fencing that shifts from one area of grazing and moves to a new location. This solution can help prevent certain areas of grasses from being over-trampled or under-cultivated. Another solution to sustain grassland productivity is to restore degraded rangeland areas and maintain the grasses with proper, consistent management. The management of grasslands and rangelands is vital for the success of such biome, and many factors contribute to such net yields. Water is one of the most major determining factors in terms of stock management. Without usable water sources, the stock would be limited to areas close to permanent water sources throughout the dry season, thereby jeopardizing the reliance on riparian zone foraging, and large areas of the grassland would not be utilized by the livestock. A solution involves creating water points around the developed grassland, but can become a costly investment. Irrigation is frequently used by commercial farmers, but the reliance on ground sources of water can become an unhealthy dependence. Vegetation of grasslands is an immensely important factor to the ecosystem. Out of the total United States 50,000 invasive species, costing approximately $135 billion annually, 300 of these species are weeds, found on the American grasslands, costing roughly $2 billion annually. Therefore, it is imperative that unwanted shrubs and other form vegetation are minimized as much as possible. A costly solution to unwanted invader plants is to spray herbicides on the grasses, mechanically remove such pests, or to practice controlled fire burning. A slightly less expensive solution is practicing short-term, intensive trampling by large numbers of livestock. The control of bushes within a grassland habitat is a necessary maintenance that must be practiced by farmers and ranchers if sustainability is to occur. Fire is another important element in concern with grasslands and rangelands, being a common agent for clearing and removing shrubs and trees. It largely determines the composition of the grassland as well, and oftentimes the management. The success of a grassland is determined by the fire's intensity, structure, and abundance of fuel, seasonality, frequency, and type. In most cases, fires in grassland regions remove inedible grasses and enables growth and access to young herbage. If perhaps a particular season has lacked the necessary spread of fire, carefully controlled and timed fires may serve as an adequate solution. Although, if fires are not monitored with the utmost care, serious damages and destruction can occur, smoldering entire grassland ecosystems in its vicious flames. Before farmers and ranchers commit to controlled burnings, they must take into account the entire ecosystem and the fire's effects on the surrounding habitats, along with the required labor and expenses. Grasslands provide significant impacts to society, including livestock feed, catchment areas, water resources of downstream habitats, major reserves of biodiversity. In some areas, 89 plant species have been crammed into a single meter of mountain grassland. Tourism and leisure opportunities, religious significance, wild foods, medicinal uses, carbon sinks, providing almost as important a sink as forests in recycling greenhouse gases, and healthy organic matter in soil. To avoid degradation, farmers and ranchers should practice even grazing, keep stock numbers of livestock and crop yields within reasonable limits, and avoid localized overgrazing. According to the United States Department of the Interior's Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Land Management, which administers about 250 million acres of public lands, manages livestock grazing on 155 million acres of those lands, as guided by federal law. The BLM administers nearly 18,000 permits and leases held by ranchers who graze their livestock, mostly cattle and sheep, at least part of the year on more than 21,000 allotments under BLM management. Permits and leases generally cover a 10-year period and are renewable if the BLM determines that the terms and conditions of the expiring permit or lease are being met. The amount of grazing that takes place each year on BLM-managed lands can be affected by such factors as drought, wildfire, and market conditions. Laws that apply to the BLM's management of public lands grazing include the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, the Endangered Species Act of 1973, the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976, and the Public Rangelands Improvement Act of 1978. Current competing interests for grasslands are stemming from ranchers, ecologists, and environmentalists. Some ranchers, in pursuit of quick profits and less land to manage, are selling off their grasslands to developers. The southeastern United States has become an immensely populated area as of recent years, and grasslands once cultivated by farmers are being converted into housing developments and small ranchettes. Consumers are investing into these properties because of scenic views and recreation activities, not the traditional cattle grazing practices the land is primarily designed for. Nonetheless, ranchers, ecologists, and environmentalists have been working together as of late to help determine which areas of our nation's grassland are suited for sustainable grazing or sustainable development, or none at all. Land trust groups are paying ranchers with key grazing areas conservation easements that bar future owners from developing the land for commercial purposes. Also, farmers have come to realize the importance in maintaining grasslands, for environmental and livestock benefits, and are transitioning into giving up pesticides and rotating cattle as a newfound practice. One additional movement towards sustainability of grasslands includes the possible use of switchgrass as a biofuel. This vegetation is highly prevalent among many of the grasslands in the United States, and switchgrass may become the center for biofuel production in some parts of the Great Plains and U.S. Midwest. President George Bush in 2006 was one of the first politicians to highlight switchgrass as a potential energy-producing resource. As of 2010, no switchgrass refineries had existed in the United States, but the possibility for the sustainable energy source is a future topic of debate. More research is definitely necessary to determine the projected environmental and socioeconomic factors involved with such energy production.